into this specific type of poetry, and what prompted you to write the article that you had?
So, the poetry in general, it's funny because my path was definitely not a traditional, if anyone can talk about a traditional path into classical South Asian literature when they were raised in the West to like Israeli parents. But I studied architecture for my bachelor's, 5-year degree. And then when I was done, I was, just traveling around, and I knew I didn't want to be an architect. And in the interval of figuring out what I wanted to do, I was practicing yoga. And it was at a center in Paris, of all places. But they sort of had like in-house swamis, and they did all the pujas, and I really fell in love with Sanskrit, and just the way it sounded. I didn't even understand what it meant, but I really liked the sonic effect of it. And so when we moved back to Israel, I was like, I want to study this, but Jewish parents, like, you have to sort of explain it to them in a way that's like, yeah, I'm going to do it for a master's degree. And I actually thought I would do yoga philosophy and things like that. But the teacher who taught all the courses that I was taking, or a lot of the courses that I was taking as part of the philosophy, was not as exciting as the person who taught me Sanskrit and who's very much into like poetry. And I took a seminar in the Ramayana, and it just blew me away, the literature and the poetry. And in Israel you have David Shulman and Yigal Bronner, and they're both. I mean, the teacher I was referring to is Yigal Bronner, and then I met David Shulman, and they're, it's just is infectious. And and anybody who works with them ends up going to South, like intellectually going to South India. And so when it was time to apply for a PhD, it was clear that I would pitch a project that involved South India. At the time, I had written a master's thesis on a genre in Sanskrit poetry called Viloma Kavya, which you can read from left to right and get one register, and then in the other direction, get a different register. And there was a lot of tension between Rama and Krishna as like very different types of role models, so to say. And I was interested in that kind of, the one very like fun-loving, sort of almost like anti-order character versus sort of the upright. And I was looking for a figure that I thought, had that tension. And somehow Eagle was like, oh, why don't you look into Krishna Devaraya? He might be a good figure to. And of course, in the end, it wasn't at all what I thought it would be, but that's sort of how I got there. So.
What is that mentioned? Is that
Uh,
not something
uh,
like
that you
trusted
talked about
yoga?
yoga. We actually had a question specifically talking about and how she used yoga as a means of escaping the separation between herself and Vishnu. So we were wondering, how was yoga used as a means of escape? Because in the context of our class, we learned of it as more of like a meditation way of getting closer to enlightenment.
So it's, here I think it's definitely a different type of practice that she's referring to. It's not. I think there might be some references. I think that sort of what ties those practices together is probably the idea of asceticism or tapas. But in the domain of bhakti, right, what Andal does is in fact tapas. but it's a different kind of tapas, right? It's she's generating heat in the conventional, according to the conventions of Sanskrit poetry, where when you're separated from your beloved, the body just generates this intense amount of heat, and then the convention is that you have to sort of treat it with all these cooling remedies and there are all these like pastes and ointments, and of course with Andal, her friends do it, and the minute they apply the paste, it dries up and crackles. Like she goes into baths and like the water, sizzle, like she's just burning, but it's with love, right? And so, in that respect, right, and her father in the Amukta Malida, he's completely clueless about these conventions, right? And so he has to go to God and says, is my daughter losing her mind? What's going on with her, right? Everybody who's read poetry knows that she's just manifesting just the very conventional, traditional signs of being lovesick. It's kind of like the rom-com trope of eating a bucket of ice cream, right? But in that genre, women in love, it just everybody knows, but he doesn't, and he asks God, what's going on with her? And he says, what kind of tapas is this? Is it some tapas I'm not aware of? Is she going mad? And he tells him a story that's really not connected, but in the end he says, whatever she's doing, it's because she's Vaishnava, right? She belongs to Vishnu. And in that respect, right, this whole story is marking kind of a new tradition, right, of obtaining God, of being of Vishnu, in which love is a practice, right? It's bhakti is sort of outlined as an how do you say it, an effective way to attain God, just as, say, Parvati, right, attain Shiva, but hers was the conventional kind of yogic practices with like standing on one foot, like between the five flames, or eating little or whatever. So there's a lot of cross references, but bhakti basically is, and this particular story is about just love.
Thank you.
So I have a question on the note of love. In the poems by Antal, do you think there was any like intent to address the notion of eroticism?
So Andal's poetry is definitely erotic. Are you like in a public space? Is this kind of a weird?
Yeah, no, it's alright. It's no one's listening.
Okay,
It's
I
all good.
wasn't sure. I had like the giggle. Yeah, I mean, it's her poetry definitely, and in general, all the original like historical Bhakti poets, their poetry has very subversive elements to it. And of course, her being a female poetess, it's like on steroids, basically, right? There are a few moments where she articulates it in very direct language. I mean, her corpus has, she's got two songs. One of them is more tame and about like community, and that's the Tirupavai. But the one that really, from which her hagiographies are then sort of crafted, or that inspire her hagiographies, is the Natyar Tiromuni. And there she's got some pretty stark comments, basically saying how she's dedicated her body to God, and if there's any talk of giving her to a mortal, she's going to kill herself, and that it's basically like letting a jackal lick the offering, like Vedic offerings, basically, right? So that's kind of the comparison she makes. So the eroticism is very explicit there, right? And that's part of why then the more she becomes central in bhakti, there's kind of a need to kind of clean it up a little,
Yeah. And just sort of like a more general question about South Indian literature. Why do you think the study of South Indian poetry is important in a contemporary context? And what do you think students can learn from this poetry?
I mean, that's a really, really tough question.
Yeah, I know it was a little broad.
It goes, I mean, I can answer it in a couple of levels. It's in part is connected to humanities, right? It's a way of thinking about stuff differently. It's about refinement. It's about culture. It's about cultivation. It's about understanding how language in certain cultures was envisioned as something that was nothing short of life changing. We're at an age where, I mean, I used to teach writing in Chicago, and there was one student who I felt was basically about to write epics for Twitter. Like Odysseus needs to get over it, right? Like sentences like that, very short, and I'm like, all right, and here I'm coming from an intellectual landscape where a poet who's the king, right, is articulating his vision of his empire, which is arguably the most significant empire in South India in the second millennium. And he's like the pinnacle of that. And he's choosing to articulate that vision in poetry, right? It says something very deep about the power that language had. And so I think, right, I understand that not everybody is into it. I don't think everybody should be passionate about specifically 16th century classical literature and Telugu. But when people ask me, but what is it good for? I always say, well, you can't have a good core or center without fringe, right? It's kind of like foregoing, like I remember in Chicago, it would be like craft beer versus, I don't know, like Budweiser or Miller Light. It's like, it's not the craft beer isn't for everyone, but it's sort of very important for maintaining healthy culture, right? Is sort of as a way of thinking about what it means to sort of be diverse in your interest, in your outlook, in how you think, and how you use language. I don't know if that was too long or too short.
No,
It's great. Okay, so we also had a question specifically about when Antal passed out and then she kind of woke up. Did she see her past, or was it more so of just knowing, feeling that past?
So, A, I didn't write it, and B, I wasn't there. But the way I read it is that, in these passing out or kind of losing it for a sec is indicative to a lot of these scenes, right? When there's like the knowing with the big K, right? With a capital K, versus to know stuff with like just the daily knowing, right? It's something that usually is so big that it kind of, it has that physical effect, right? I mean, just think about it. They just sort of reveal to her something that's like mind-blowing. So her mind blew and she passed out. But the minute she was revived, right, it all came to her, right? When like they told her it came to her, she passed out. But when she it's kind of like flipping the switch, right? It's like when there's an overload on the electrical system, something pops,
yeah.
right? And then you have to, reboot the system. And so that's kind of what I think happened. But from that moment on, that's kind of where there's the shift in the narrative in terms of how Krishnadevaraya chooses to tell it.
Do you think along with that shift comes a shift in Antal's personal view of herself as more of a deity or like supernatural power?
So two things. A lot of times gods and goddesses don't know that they're that, right? And in part, that's because if they come to Earth as a human being, there's a reason for that, right? There's something they need to experience as a human being, right? So they can't quite achieve it with supernatural powers, right? It's latent in them, but it's kind of like the question of Rama's divinity. I don't know if you guys have background with the Ramayana or not, but it's a fairly common thing, right? That gods need to be reminded that they're divine, right? And so she didn't know before this interaction about her divine status, but her divine status is sort of what brought her to that point, right? So she again, the logic of the story and the logic of a lot of these types of stories is that she wouldn't know that she's divine.
Dom, do you have any more questions?
I don't. There was two parts to your question, no? And by the way, her name is Anda. So Tamil has half of the alphabet of Sanskrit and of other, like, or Telugu even. So a lot of the letters do double duty and sometimes triple duty. So so her name is Anda. Just sorry. So, but your question had two parts. It was.
I guess it was kind of talking about agency.
Does she know? And then the second part does she use her powers or something like that? Was that it?
No, it was more so just talking about the broader theme of like human agency and divine power and how those shifted in.
So, as a human being, she can't. So the story, right, is articulated from a point of view that already takes away human agency from the story, right? Like historically, Andal is a human, like is a human being that we know existed to some extent because she's got a literary corpus. But later hagiographies, took that corpus and sort of deified her. Right? She became more and more central in Sri Vaishnava worship, and you could kind of, with the hagiographies, you see her path, metaphorically speaking, from being human to being divine, right? And with that means that the story changes. Hagiographies do that. They kind of reflect how the community understands this figure within the current context, right? And so that means they have to rework things that don't quite fit the new paradigm. And so according to this, the later shifts in which it reflects the importance of Sri Viliputur and Andal's temple, right? So that's the part of the story that objects to merging of Andal and Ranganatha, right? And insisting that there be a wedding in Sri Viliputur without any merging and then them moving back. So that's one aspect, right, of her divine status within Sri Vaishnavism as a goddess who's separate. But also as they articulate her role as a goddess who wanted to experience human love, right? She wanted, she's his eternal consort, so she knows what it's like to love him in his divine form, but she doesn't, she's like heard about all these like human devotees that melt away and pine away, but she doesn't know what that feels like. She wants to, right? And the South Indian literature is filled with that trope, right? Of sort of God being jealous of humans because they feel, right? and in a way that gods can't. And she wants that, right? And so that's why she comes to Earth, right? And so, in order for her to kind of then take the trajectory that will lead her back to his side, she first has to go through the human pining, right? But because she's a goddess, right, without the transformation or the revelation, right, then there's the tension. Like, who's the actor here, right? Is it divine or human? And that's why I think there's that the story unfolds the way it does, right? She has the trajectory as a human being. She pines away. She's in love with him. But she becomes who we know her to be only after, like, she gets that divine knowledge. Like, or the knowledge of herself as divine.
Tom, do you have any other questions for her?
You can ask the last one about temple and court she.
All right. So, in this scenario, the the poet is also a monarch as well. So, what does this signify in terms of the spread of vernacular languages such as Tamil in this context?
So, one sec. Sorry. I know that if I don't say that I'll be right back, my mom will not. So this question has a couple of aspects to it. The first has to do with how Krishnadevaraya, who is most likely, and again, this I quote others, it's not anything I would argue for because I don't have the ear to do it, but Narayana, he's made this claim that Krishnadevaraya's Telugu indicates that he was not a native Telugu speaker, and most likely his mother was a Tulu speaker, and most likely that's the language that he grew up with. And yet he chooses to write in Telugu, and in the introduction to the piece, right, there's a dialogue with Andhra Vishnu, the Vishnu of Andhra, who tells him, like, you wrote all these works in Sanskrit, like, why not Telugu? Is it beneath you? Like, write for me in Telugu, and because you do, like, kings will. So there's an articulation of what it means politically to a certain extent to write in Telugu. And historically, we know, right, that at this point, Sanskrit was the way to sort of articulate a certain type of power that sort of was more pan-Indian and had to do with, like, Kshatriya status. But there was also, like, vernacularization and elites that were more and more domains in which power was articulated in the vernacular. And so you have both of those things going on. There's a point in that same introduction where he says the Andhra Vishnu, of all the languages of the land, Telugu is the sweetest, and that's been used in modern sort of like language nationalism. It's been used as a slogan, right, to sort of show that there's like an early sense of Telugu speaking pride, but it's not. It's not at all a national thing. It's more about, again, articulation of power. What I personally think, and that's kind of the core of my dissertation and hopefully the book, is that what's really unique here is that the articulation of his specific vision of like sovereignty is so intertwined with a religious community, right? He's like basically narrating his empire as outlined through the Sri Vaishnava community, and that's very unique and pretty pathbreaking in that respect, because the poetry from the genre that he's writing in before that never did that kind of stuff. But he can, he's the king, so.
I think that was all our questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for taking your time.
Yeah, sure, my pleasure. And I'm sorry for the little glitch before, but I'm glad we somehow managed to salvage it.
Yep.
All right, good
All
luck
right.
tomorrow.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Take care.
All right, bye.